You took probation. You had no idea how hard it was going to be. Maybe you've been a model probationer. You've done everything that the judge asked from you and your probation officers asked from you. Can you get off of probation early? Well, many times the answer can be yes. Now I'm going to talk to you for a few minutes about Texas law and how it applies to you, but maybe you're not in Texas. Take a few minutes, do a Google search, figure out exactly what your state law says, or call an attorney, a criminal attorney in your state to get these specifics. But I want to tell you this, listen, Texas is pretty hardcore when it comes to getting off probation early. So there's a good chance that what I'm going to cover with you here today, if this applies to you here, then there's a good chance you'll be qualified for it in your state. So let's jump into this. The first thing we have to ask ourselves, what is there a concern about whether or not I am actually qualified for an early release from probation? There are certain types of crimes, particularly in Texas, that you're just barred from consideration. You cannot get an early release from probation. For instance, let's say you took a 3G offense. Under Texas, those are qualified like aggravated assault, deadly weapons, aggravated robbery, aggravated kidnapping. Those type of aggravated offenses, you cannot get an early release from probation. Also, many intoxication-related offenses, you can't get an early release for those either. And then, of course, registering as a sex offender and most sex-based offenses, you cannot qualify for an early release. So one of the things we look at here is, what is an early release for probation? Well, if you find out that you're on a particular crime that doesn't get on that exclusion list, now we're going to examine some examples of what you can consider, breaking down two types of probation. One is a straight probation, one is a deferred adjudication. So first of all, what is an early release from straight probation? If you are on straight probation, here's what the law says in Texas. You can petition the court for an early release in most instances after you've served 1/3. So 33% of your probation has been served on a probated sentence or 2 years, whichever is less, okay? And this a third time review is discretionary on part of the judge. So the judge doesn't have to grant it, but once you get a third of the way through it, now you can petition the court for consideration to get off early. Most judges will, I will tell you, especially in Texas and the North Texas area, most of these judges are going to require you to get to the halfway point. We have been able to get some folks off at the third of the way through, but it really depends on the crime, drug crimes, maybe offenses like criminal trespass, non-real victim-based crimes. But otherwise, many of these judges want to force you to get halfway through that probation before they'll even consider letting you get off early, okay? A halftime review is mandatory if an application is made. So if you're talking about a straight probation, and remember what a straight probation is. Straight probation means you pled guilty and you were convicted. You were sentenced, but your sentence was probated, and this is on your record. Well, you can still petition the court to get off early in many instances, and if you wait till the halfway point in your probation, so let's say you had a 6-year probation, if you wait till the 3-year point, you can do it as early as the 2-year point, which I just covered. You get to the 3 years completed, the court has to consider it, okay? But it doesn't mean they have to rule in your favor. So that's one example there. So if the judge denies it, then the court's going to give you some reasons for it, and what we like to do is, look, the court should give us some idea of what's holding you back, okay? I'm going to warn you right now, a lot of probation officers are very resistant when it comes to granting an early release from probation. So it can be extremely frustrating whenever you're asking that and they don't grant it. So one of the things we like to do is to make sure that we go back if they deny it and find out what's holding us up and why we can't get it granted, okay? So that's one of the examples there. Now, what is an early release from deferred adjudication? If you're on deferred adjudication probation, you can petition the court for early release technically at any time. Now, I'm going to just tell you, I know I said that, and some of y'all might be saying, great, I've been on probation for 2 days, I can get off. No. As a practical matter, I'm going to tell you right now, most judges, it doesn't work that way. They're going to want you to cover at least a third, close to half. Many of the judges in North Texas are going to want you to have half of your probation completed before they will even consider for an early release. But in theory, you can get off sooner. Now, I'm going to give you a list of conditions to be aware of here in a second if you want that early release from probation, okay? Now, you're much more likely to have that request granted if a significant portion of your probation has been completed. So it allows the judge, once you petition the court to have an early release from deferred adjudication, it allows the court to determine this. Here's what the court determines. Is it in the best interest of society and the defendant to have you receive an early release? That's pretty subjective, right? That's a very opinionated situation. So that's why you have to really present information to the court. And if you do it at the very early part of the probation being completed, the judge is much likely to deny it, okay? Now, what about, let's cover a couple of examples here. What about probation for a family violence offense? This is one that comes up. Maybe it's a domestic violence offense. Maybe it was a fight between a brother and a sister, a husband and a wife. Maybe it was between roommates, because in Texas, you can be charged with that and end up on a probation. It wasn't like beating up your wife or your husband. This was actually a situation where it was between you and a roommate, and you can be on probation for domestic violence. Well, can you get off of a probation early there? Yes, you can. Now, I'm going to tell you, as a practical matter, the facts are going to be looked at. So a judge is going to look back and say, if some guy's beating up on his wife, he's going to have a hard time with that, right? If it's between roommates and that roommate's moved on and they don't have contact with each other, much higher probability that the court would grant that in your request, okay? So whether or not the early release is granted, a family violence offense that has been deferred can never get taken off your record. So it's important to understand, you want to get the foot or the shoe of the government off your throat by getting off probation, but it doesn't mean you can get the arrest or the charge removed from your criminal record, okay? Now, let me give you some steps to consider before you apply for an early release. The worst thing you could do is apply for an early release from probation and you don't really stand a chance. You need to know some of these things before you spend the money to hire a lawyer to get this done. Number one, have you completed all the court-ordered classes and conditions of your probation? If you've not completed your conditions of probation, if you haven't taken all your classes, if you haven't finished your community service, if you haven't done those things, then the court is not going to approve your probation early release, okay? Number two, make sure all your court fines, your court costs, and your probation fees are paid up. I didn't say you have to pay them all off all the way through the end of your probation, but you need to be caught up on where you need to be. Otherwise, the court's going to deny your request. Number three, if you have had violations and sanctions during the term of your probation, then expect the judge to be very picky about deciding whether or not to let you off probation early. In fact, the more violations you had, the less likely it is that the court's going to even consider you for that early release, okay? Now, number four, look, I know this is frustrating, and sometimes you can have a jerk for a probation officer, but you need to maintain a good relationship with your probation officer, because I want to tell you how this works. Essentially, what takes place is this. The first thing the judge is going to do when you petition the court for an early release from probation is they're going to send a request down to your PO asking, hey, how were they? Do you recommend them for an early release? Well, what if you did everything you were supposed to do, but you didn't have a good relationship, or at least you were not cordial and nice to your probation officer? Well, the first thing they're going to do is say, absolutely not. I don't like that guy. He's a jerk. He didn't do what I said to do. And even though he met the conditions, I think he's a risk. That can hurt your chances of being able to receive an early release from probation. So the better your performance on your probation and your relationship with your probation officer, the higher the probability that you're going to be able to get that early release. Now, the next point I want to make is get ready to be given a drug test. This is a big one. We get people call us all the time and say, hey, I want an early release from probation. And I'll say, can you pass a hair follicle test? Because if you can't pass a hair follicle test, don't even ask. I had a guy that one time told me, oh, no, I'm good. I can pass my hair follicle test. It's not a big deal. He goes in for an early release, gives a hair follicle test, and then he violates for using meth and heroin. Well, what do you think happened? They filed a petition to revoke his probation to try to force him into rehab. And we even asked him, man, look, this is a condition. You've got to make sure if you're going to ask to get off early, are you going to pass? And that's a concern. So you need to make sure you can pass a hair follicle test, because they are going to drug test you to determine if you're eligible for that early release. Now, the next point is if you are released from deferred adjudication, you may then, here's what will happen. Your case will actually be dismissed. That will then start the clock to allow you to get the arrest potentially sealed or non-disclosed from your criminal record. Now, if you were convicted on a straight probation, you may actually be eligible for a non-disclosure if you receive what's called judicial clemency. And I'll cover that here in just a second. And that's a little bit more rare. But it's important, if you're going to finish up a probation, you want to try to also get the entire arrest removed from your record in some way. Even if it's just, you can't get an expunction, but you can at least get it sealed so that you can get a good job and not have this hanging over your head. Okay. Now, finally, What is this term, judicial clemency? Well, technically the way it works, what if you're on straight probation and the judge discharges you from probation and on a straight probation? Well, there's this kind of very unknown area of the law, particularly in Texas, where technically the judge can set aside the verdict and allow the probationer to withdraw his plea, his or her plea, and dismiss the actual accusations against you. And then at that point, it will allow you to make a request. But here's the key. You got to do it within 30 days of the judge granting this. You have to make a request for what's known as judicial clemency. Now, if you do that within 30 days after discharging you from that probation, the judge could consider that you're eligible to receive that judicial clemency. And at that point, you could be potentially eligible to get this sealed from your record. Okay. Now, look, so the question is this. Can you get an early release from probation? You can, it's possible, but it's really important that you talk to an attorney that knows exactly how this stuff works. That way they can help you make sure that you're potentially eligible. You don't want to waste your money. And almost every probation officer, particularly in the North Texas area, they're going to require you to hire an attorney to file a petition for early release from probation. So if you or a loved one are facing a probation situation and you're trying to get off early in the North Texas area, don't hesitate to contact the Hampton Law Firm at the number above. And I want to thank you for listening today. Listen, if you're on probation, you've done a good job, you owe it to yourself. Get off probation early. See you next time.